Right. I think we are live. We're going to wait just a minute. I know there's some of you in the waiting room already. So if you can hear me, go ahead and chime in and let me know. I'm coming in loud and clear before we dive into today's live Q&A session. So welcome. We're doing an impromptu today. Usually I do these on Thursday, but due to travel schedules, I had to switch the date up. So again, if you can hear me, go ahead and type that into the chat box. Let me know that I'm coming in loud and clear on your end. And then we'll get going here shortly. Okay, looks like we are coming in. So, all right, so we're going to dive in. If you've got questions that you'd like me to answer, it's an open Q&A today, but I'm also going to be talking about how to test for food sensitivities. So it's one of the biggest questions that we get asked. Food sensitivities. It's one of the most common problems that's a driver of autoimmune disease in today's society is food. As a matter of fact, of the four triggers, food is probably the most common, gluten being the most common food. So gluten sensitivity being one of the most common components to the driving factors behind autoimmune disease, but other foods can do it as well. For those of you who may be familiar with my work in my book, No Grain, No Pain, one of the stories that I wrote about was one of my patients, Ginger, who was a young girl. Her mom brought her to see me when she was 9 years old. And she was struggling with a terminal juvenile rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis. So she diagnosed at the age of 2 with a form of autoimmune arthritis. And for 7 years, the doctors medicated her. And she was in and out of the hospital for pain management. And then they basically said, your daughter's going to die. You need to get ready and prepare for that. And that's when I met her. Her name is Ginger. And we found out that one of her food sensitivities, she was gluten sensitive, but one of the things that was really holding her back from healing was her reaction to blueberries, of all things. And if you could imagine, her mom was giving her a blueberry smoothie every morning as part of a strategy to introduce, high nutrient powered foods. And so in her case, in Ginger's case, it was actually creating and contributing to the disease process. So it wasn't until we were capable of figuring that out that Ginger was able to make a full recovery. And that's why, one of the biggest holdups for people on their journeys with autoimmune disease is food sensitivity. And unfortunately, and I've heard this from a number of doctors, and it's so mind-blowing, maybe is the best word I can pick, but it's so mind-blowing that so many doctors, I've actually heard allergists, experts, medical doctors who are experts in allergy, say that food allergies don't exist, or say that food sensitivities don't exist. And this is, nothing could be further from the truth. I think it was Time magazine, even over 15 years ago, that on the cover, why are our kids becoming more allergic and sensitive to foods was the topic of that cover. So we know they exist. Many of you, tuning in today, I'm certain probably many of you chiming in could say, yes, understanding what I was reacting to helped me on my journey to better health and healing. And so my point was that doctors generally, because a lot of them won't even admit that food sensitivity is a thing, they refuse to do any types of testing. And so, when you hear me talk each week about the importance of knowing, the importance of testing and not guessing, because delayed food sensitivities have a window of inflammation reaction that's as long as 3 weeks. And so it's different than the acute allergy. That's the allergy test that people get when they go to generally the allergist, and they do a skin patch test. And so that test will measure what's known as acute allergies. These are things that, your lips swell, you break out in hives, you're sneezing, or you're got mucus coming out of your face, right? And those are kind of classic allergy symptoms. And so most people understand acute allergies pretty well, but it's the delayed ones that, in my opinion, are the most damaging, because they're insidious, because they're not obvious. You could eat, in Ginger's case, she was eating blueberries every day, and she didn't feel bad in the process of eating the blueberries, but the blueberries were inflaming her on a subliminal level that kept her body sick. and inflamed and kept her joints swollen. But after eating blueberries, she didn't have an immediate swelling reaction. It was just enough every day to cause that latent long-term inflammation. And again, with delayed reactions, that window is 2 to 3 weeks long for most people. So it becomes very challenging, even if you're doing a food elimination diet, to understand, to understand what you're reactive to, because food elimination diets can be helpful, but they do not pick up very easily on delayed hypersensitivity responses. Again, this is when the immune system is primed to react against foods in a lower level of inflammation that continues to allow for persistent problems. And so how do we measure that, right? How do we quantify that? If our bodies are not screaming at us after we eat that meal, how do we then go about trying to quantify that? Well, we test. And that's one of the best ways to do it. Now, remember, your immune system has a lifespan of about 6 to 8 months. And so if you're trying to overcome or combat an autoimmune problem, it takes about 18 months to do that. And so starting with food and understanding how best you can manipulate or change your diet so that at the very least you're not eating foods that are going to create immunological reactions that perpetuate the inflammatory process, keeping you sick, then one of the best ways to do that is testing. So again, another question we get on food sensitivity is, what's the difference among different types of tests? For example, there's IgG testing, there's IgA testing, there's IgM testing, and there's IgE testing. So IgE is an acute reaction, and that's the one your allergist will typically measure doing a skin prick or a patch test. Then there's 5 different ways the immune system can react aside from that IgE response. And these are all delayed, so they fall in that delayed category. But there's IgG responses, there's IgA, there's IgM, and then there's T cell response and immune complex response. And so what most allergy tests and most allergy panels measure, if we're talking about delayed responses, is they only measure IgG. And so there's 2 fundamental problems with that type of technology platform. It's number one, not all IgG antibodies, when measured and high, are necessarily an indicator that that item or that food is hurting an individual, because some antibodies are protective. So you can have protective IgG antibodies. And so if you run like some of these online tests that people do, where they get back a result and they're allergic to a lot of different things, at least according to that lab, a lot of those tests are IgG tests. And so what they're doing is they're not differentiating between whether you're actually being harmed by that food or whether or not you have some protective antibodies that you've produced as a result of exposure to that food, and that food is not actually harming you. So those types of tests can be very misleading. And in my experience, a lot of them come back with false positive results, meaning you're allergic to almost everything that you eat. And so then you become paralyzed around how to make the choice of what foods you should consume because there's so very little to eat. And that's a huge point of frustration for a lot of people who originally come see me, is they've been told they're allergic to all of their favorite foods, and not even their favorite foods, but a lot of the staple foods that they were consuming, and not because they were allergic to them, but because they had protective antibodies and there was no differentiation in the test that they ran. So that's one of the hallmark problems. And so again, most of the online testing world will only measure that type of food response. And that's why most doctors don't like it, because they understand that measuring IgG alone is it, and they're right, it is not an accurate assessment of whether or not you're reacting to the food. And that's part of the reason why we use a different technological platform where we're measuring what's called lymphocyte response in a very unique way, where we're actually subjecting the immune cells to different agents, and we're seeing them either react or not react, right, in lifetime under microscopy. So we can actually detect and differentiate these different immunological reactions, the IgG, the IgA, the IgM, the immune complex, and the T cell responses, where we're certain what you're reactive to versus what maybe is a false positive. And so a lot of our testing, I've been doing testing on this platform for almost 20 years now in my practice. And so, what we tend to get are very, very accurate results that show exactly what foods a person needs to cut out, but we don't get a huge battery of foods that a person has to cut out. So we don't get this list of 50 foods. And so now we're shrinking this person's diet unnecessarily as a result of, of massive reactions, or at least perceived massive reactions. So big difference in the type of testing that's done. And again, the window of reactivity is very long and makes it hard for doing a food diet history or an elimination diet to really ascertain what the responses are. I mean, I've had cases of severe neuromusculoskeletal autoimmune diseases where once we found that information out, we were able to break through major plateaus for people and really get them back on the right track to better health. Okay, so again, if you've got questions, I wanted to cover that because I wanted to make that announcement, and I'll put a link in for you guys. If you'd like to learn more about delayed hypersensitivity testing, you can check that out. Let me throw that link in the feed for you. Give me just a second here. I'll pull it up and find it. Here we go. Okay, just put that in the feed. Okay, so again, if you've got questions you'd like me to answer today, we'll dive into some of those as well. So it looks like we've got some coming in. If I've avoided a food for some time, will the test recognize it as a trigger? Wondering if I need to be eating the food before I can do the test. No. So that's one of the other benefits. It's kind of similar with gluten. The doctor will tell a patient to eat gluten for, for weeks. Even that patient may know that gluten is going to hammer them and wreck their health. The doctor wants them to eat it anyway so that they can do a test. No, with this type of testing that we're doing, you don't have to be consuming the food to get an accurate result back. And that's one of the other advantages. Dennis wants to know, off topic a little bit, but good question. Why do some people who smoke live well into their 90s? Because they're what we would call anomalies. Like I would never, one, I think that I would never compare my health, let's say, to somebody else's, or compare my ability to do something to someone else's, because we all have gifts and strengths. I'm, for example, one of my gifts is I'm fast in my brain. My brain is very fast and thinks very quickly. And that's a gift. Not everybody has that, but I'm not a fast runner. So I wouldn't want to go on the track and race against somebody who is super fast. So I wouldn't obviously put myself in that environment, because what it would do is it would crush my ego and my confidence. And so I don't want to get into the habit of comparing myself, my skills and my abilities to other people's. Some people can smoke into their 90s because they're fantastic lung clearance. They've got kind of an anomalous ability to clear their own lungs and to protect themselves from the damage of smoke inhalation and from the chemicals and the carcinogens found in cigarettes. And so, and I don't know that there's any way that we have to date where we can recognize, and do tests to identify who those people are. And even if we could, I still don't know that you'd want to take that risk, because it's a pretty big risk to take. Let's see here. Another question about testing. If the test is positive, does that mean the food has to be avoided forever, or can it potentially be reintroduced? That's a great question, Jessica. One of the things about your immune system, again, I've said this earlier, it's new. It recycles. The cells are brand new every 6 to 8 months. And a lot of times people with autoimmune disease, the longer they have it and the longer the problems persist, the more and more their immune system starts overreacting to everything, including food. So they start kind of collecting food allergies, if you will, and they start, over time become allergic to a lot of different things. The great thing about knowing what you're reacting to and eliminating it is it allows for your immune system to calm down, right? If you think of your immune system when it's hyper reacting to the environment, it's because it's being overworked. And so if we can take the stress and the pressure away then the immune cells calm down. And when they give birth to the next line of immune cells, those immune cells are even calmer. And so with each passing generation, again, every 6 months or so, you have brand new circulating cells. There's less and less of a reaction. So what happens when a person does food sensitivity testing and they eliminate those foods, generally for at least 6 to 8 months, a lot of times they're able to reintroduce those foods. And so it's not necessarily a life sentence. Food sensitivities are not, there's what we call an acquired food reaction, and then there's what we call a true allergy to a food. A true allergy is the classic anaphylactic shock or response where your lips swell, your throat constricts, you break out in hives, and you go to the hospital. A food sensitivity, however, usually those are acquired as a result of the immune system, the function being dysregulated and being hyperreactive. And usually it happens as a result of an onslaught of environmental and food-based triggers that a person is bombarding themselves with. And so what do I mean by that? Processed food, food additives, food dyes, chemical fragrances, chemicals in their hair care products, chemicals in cosmetics, chemicals in the environment outside, all these things that we're being bombarded with on a constant basis today. And then you combine that with poor food choice, right? So eating foods that have low nutrient density, that don't provide our immune systems with the nourishment needed to help regulate the response. And so it's this perfect storm that can be created. And so if we can figure out what not to eat for a long enough period of time, combined with good dietary choices, combined with good lifestyle behaviors, right? So sleep at the proper time, clean air, clean water, exercise, stress management, the right diet. This is what's critical. And you do that for 6 to 8 months. And a lot of times on these food sensitivities, a lot of those foods you can become reintroduced because you can regain tolerance to them. Okay. Let's see here. So question about, I'm pulse testing for food sensitivities, not a fan. There are very few ways to get super good accuracy on food sensitivity testing. Again, the vast majority of those on the market, in my opinion today, they're misleading and they take people down the wrong road. Do I take prayer requests? My sister in California just took her 5th. I'm so sorry, Mark. Her 5th shot. So I do. I take prayer requests, and if you want to put your sister's name in, I'll be happy to include her in my prayers. Yeah, I hate to hear that. A small amount of mucus after I eat a certain amount of chicken. Is this potentially a food sensitivity? It might be, and it might not be. Mucus formation during a meal or after a meal, it may or may not be food reactivity. Some people will produce mucus because remember what mucus is. Mucus in your GI tract, as you're making it, it helps to coat and line the GI tract. You also make antibodies in that mucus because the act of eating, even if you're not allergic to the food, there are things in our food that our immune system is supposed to regulate from getting into our body. And so the production of mucus is one of the ways that our immune system is kind of upregulating to make sure that we have the immune IgA present to protect us from any things in our food that could be potential problematic, and create an issue where those things leak across the barrier of the GI tract. I mean, this is what we call oftentimes intestinal permeability or leaky gut, where the contents of the gut can leak into the bloodstream and create havoc. And so that mucus can just be a protective mechanism. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're allergic. Now, if you're eating something and you're just raining mucus, I would probably look at that as closer to a potential for a food reaction. If when you eat, you find the same type of reaction occurring in an aggressive fashion, but not as a general rule of thumb, not just some small mucus. Tina says, I just ordered Gluten Shield and try to eat gluten-free bread, but I cheat on weekends when I go out. Will the Gluten Shield help my body to handle it better? It depends on, so what gluten, so Tina, that's a good question. And I want to just say, I wouldn't recommend that you cheat for several reasons. Number one, when you eat the size of a breadcrumb of gluten, if you're gluten sensitive, okay, that the damage can and the inflammation can persist for 2 to 3 months. So if you're cheating every weekend, you're creating an inflammatory response all the time, and it just never really truly has an opportunity to heal or go away. Now, what Gluten Shield was designed to do was, it wasn't designed so that you could take some and then, say, for example, go have a piece of pizza or a Subway sandwich. It was more designed so that when you're out eating, traveling, where there's the possible risk of cross-contamination, which is any restaurant that you go to, there's a huge risk of cross-contamination anytime you eat what we call OPF, other people's food. If you don't have your hand in preparing all the food, knowing where all the ingredients came from, etc., the risk of cross-contamination is just high. And that's what Gluten Shield was designed to do, was to support you from being cross-contaminated or exposed to small amounts, not purposeful amounts of gluten, if that makes sense. And so I don't want you to get the wrong idea about Gluten Shield. There is no enzymatic product. And some of the companies that are out there have horrific ethics because they're advertising their enzyme products to protect you from gluten so that you can eat it. And none of them are designed to work that way. The science is absolutely clear on that. These products do not allow you to go out and just eat a gluten bomb. They're more specifically, again, they're designed to protect you from cross-contamination or the potential possibility that you're going to get some gluten in the food by accident. And so the enzyme can help to degrade and break down some of the smaller quantities. But if you bombard it, you can take the whole bottle and it's not going to pull you out of a nightmare of an experience if you're gluten sensitive. Now, if you're trying to recover from a gluten bomb, if you got gluten bombed and you're trying to recover, there are other things that you can do too. I've got some videos on that, how to recover from getting hit with a major gluten exposure. I don't want you to think that you can go eat gluten using Gluten Shield, and then if you get hurt because you feel so confident you can just take that enzyme, and then you're getting hurt because I wasn't ethical or moral in helping you understand how that product is designed to work. Okay. Yeah, I agree. So we got somebody saying trying to outguess the menu, the chef, the wait staff. OMG, we pack a lot of our own food when we travel. To me, Gluten Shield just speeds up transit time. Yeah, I always pack food when I travel. As a matter of fact, before I jumped on today, this is lunch right here. It's my version of chicken soup. It's a mixture of chicken breast that was pressure cooked with a little bit of carrot, potato, celery, onion, garlic, and bone broth. I just prefer my own food because I know where it came from. I know how it was grown. I know where it was grown. I know about the ingredients, and so I can be sure that I'm going to nourish my body in the best possible way. If I tested negative for celiac disease in 2011, would it be possible to be celiac now? Christina is asking. Yes, it would be, because the testing, Christina, for celiac disease is fraught with error. As a matter of fact, one of my patients, this was years ago, she came into the clinic and she had 19 biopsies performed in her lifetime. And she was an older woman. And so imagine 19 biopsies of the small intestine on separate occasions. That's being put under 19 times and having 19 different biopsies done in the GI office. All 19 results were negative for celiac, meaning that she tested negative 19 times. And then on the 20th time, her result finally came back positive. For some people, the gluten reaction takes a lot of time to create the damage to the villi in the small intestine. And so that a lot of the tests for celiac are only as accurate as the nature of which gluten affects you. So if for example, some people don't get villus atrophy at all, that's not the way gluten impacts them. As a matter of fact, a lot of people that I see, they've got rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis. autoimmune arthritides, or they've got, you know, a neurological autoimmunity like multiple sclerosis. And so gluten is impacting their joints or their nervous system, but it's not as damaging to those individuals in their GI tract, creating that villus atrophy. And so celiac disease never shows up as a diagnostic because the damage wasn't affecting the GI tract as much, it was affecting other tissues. This is one of the reasons why we oftentimes refer to gluten as the great hydra, because it can mimic so many different types of conditions, and really create confusion around the diagnostic. So if you've had, again, biopsies, remember biopsies, even if you had a positive biopsy, well, think of it like this: a biopsy that's positive for villus atrophy, which is a hallmark of diagnosing gluten sensitivity, is still misleading, even if it's positive, because soy can cause villus atrophy, corn can cause villus atrophy, parasite infection can cause villus atrophy, meat glue, which is a product found in hot dogs and other processed meats, can cause villus atrophy. Food additives and processed dyes and other chemicals can cause villus atrophy. So there's a lot of things that can cause villus atrophy, gluten being one of them, which is why a villus atrophy biopsy is not a gold. It shouldn't be a gold standard for diagnosing celiac. It's an important criteria, but I don't think it should be the gold standard. And then the blood tests. The problem with a lot of the blood tests, if you've had those in the main, there's 3 main blood tests that doctors will run for celiac. One of them is called anti-tissue transglutaminase. Another one is called anti-endomysial antibodies, and then the third is anti-gliadin antibodies. And these tests are fraught with the potential for false negatives. And that's because one of the side effects of gluten is that it can cause suppression of immune antibodies. And so if it's causing you to not make adequate antibodies, and here these doctors are measuring antibodies to these different, you know, agents, including gluten, and they can't find any, it could very well be that they can't find any because one of the side effects of gluten is it's suppressing your overall ability to make those antibodies. And so that's another reason why blood testing can be so tricky, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I always recommend genetic testing. Genetic testing, in my opinion, should be the gold standard across the board if you're trying to see whether or not you want to take gluten out of your diet, you know, to keep good health. So hopefully that's helpful for you, because it's a tricky thing to navigate. And if you've had a negative test in 2011 for celiac disease, but nobody ever did genetic testing on you, then you really would have probably asked for that first and start there. Let's see, I have a recurring rash that doesn't seem to be going away. It's driving me nuts. Do you think I have a sensitivity to a certain food? What do you think of elemental diet for a short period? You know, an elemental diet is a super restrictive diet. I'm not opposed to it, and I sometimes do put people on elemental diets. And it very well could be the food itself. The problem with an elemental diet is you can't do it forever. And if you're not doing it for 6 to 8 months, which I don't recommend that you try, then you're going to at some point have to reintroduce that food, and that rash is going to come back if it's food induced. So, you know, I would say over an elemental diet, I would absolutely say get tested. Can eczema be cured? Yeah, all the time. Actually, if you check out my archived videos, there's a section under testimonials, and you'll see one of the worst cases of eczema is a woman, beautiful woman. Her face, severe eczema, and her face was swollen so severely. And for her, in her case, she had also had a number of other autoimmune problems, including polymyalgia, which is a form of autoimmune disease that affects muscles and creates damage to the muscles. But you know, within a short frame of time, and I say short frame, less than 18 months in her case, we were able to get her face from swollen severely with full spectrum eczema down to normal. So yes, it is capable. Now, most doctors won't tell you that it's possible to heal eczema without just suppressing it with drugs. And there are no shortage of prescription meds that doctors, dermatologists will prescribe people for eczema, but eczema is very much nutritionally related. A lot of people don't realize skin grows from the inside out, not from the outside in. So applying creams and lotions is not going to have a long-term effect, and you become addicted to creams and lotions in order to keep something at bay. But the reality is that inside out inflammation is still there. It's not going to go away just because you mask it with a steroid cream. If you eat corn, can you still eat chicken that was fed corn? Yes. Good question, Sue. This is another one that comes up a lot. Remember what birds are. Birds are capable of eating, processing, and digesting seed. That is part of their forte. Birds are seed eaters. And so if any species is going to eat seed as a predominant form of food for calories, birds are where it's at. And so birds, again, they have the digestive tract to break it all down. Nobody has ever studied chicken and said, hey, there's gluten in that chicken meat as a result of that chicken eating some seed, grass seed. And so, yes, it is safe. Now, one of the problems, though, I just say it's safe from a gluten perspective, right? But let's come over here to a different perspective, which is what happens when a person eats that chicken that's purely grain fed, like many of the commercial agricultural chicken houses just feed pure grain, predominantly cornmeal. What happens is not gluten, but what happens is it changes the fatty acid content of the chicken meat itself. And so what it does is it makes that chicken meat a very high omega-6 profile. And that's not supposed to be the case for chickens. Chickens they're not supposed to have a massive omega-6 content in their meat. And so what happens if you eat, if you're a chickentarian, which a lot of people are, this is one of the most popular meats that people consume, is that you're eating too many omega-6 fatty acids in that meal. And so over time, you create an imbalance of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. Now that balance in most humans should be under 4, meaning, for every 4 omega-6, you should get at least 1 omega-3, right? So a 4-to-1 ratio here, right? And a lot of the research shows that the ratio in humans, for thousands of years has been closer to 1-to-1, right? So for every 1 omega-6, you get 1 omega-1 or 1 omega-3, sorry. But you eat a chicken that's purely grain fed and you're getting like 16 or 20-to-1 in that ratio. And what that does to humans is it creates the propensity for heightened levels of inflammation. That's why we don't want that 6:3 ratio to be out of balance. And that's something you can get measured if you're concerned with it. Ask your doctor to run a test called an omega check, very standard type of blood test that can measure the percentage of omega-6s and omega-3s in your blood cells to see whether or not you're getting too much. Your histocyst seems to aid in digestion for me. Is that possible? I like it. I like it too. And yes, it is possible. It's not a digestive enzyme, but what it does is it stabilizes mast cells. And so what many people struggle with food is a histamine intolerance. And so histamine is a chemical that's secreted by certain types of white blood cells. And there are foods that also contain high histamine. And so what histocyst does is it doesn't degrade the histamine from the food that you eat, but it stabilizes the membranes around your immune cells and it appropriates the release of histamine. So basically, if you don't have that stabilization around those immune cells, sometimes they vomit too much histamine, and histamine's a vasoactive peptide that can disrupt digestion. It definitely can do that. And so that's probably the effect that you're getting from it. So you might also look at whether or not you're histamine intolerant. You can ask, I always say ask your doctor, but whether they'll measure it or whether they've even heard of these enzymes, but you can always ask. So there's DAO. It's an enzyme. Diamine oxidase is an enzyme that you can have measured in your blood, and that enzyme is responsible for degrading histamine. And another enzyme that helps degrade histamine is called tryptase. And again, those can be measured. And if you're very low in those enzymes, that sometimes is why people develop histamine intolerance, among other reasons. That's one thing that you can have measured, though. Last year, I took KBMO labs for food inflammation to test for sensitivities. It was recommended by a health coach as one of the best tests to take. But I'm curious. I don't like to say, Heather, I don't like to say anything bad about other companies. But you asked the question, so I'm not going to say anything bad about them. I'm just going to tell you that from an accuracy standpoint, I've been doing this 21 years. And one of the first questions scientifically that I ever had was, how accurate is this testing? And so one of the criteria that we have is something called reproducibility criteria. What does that mean? That means that if I were to take your blood and ship it to a lab to have it analyzed, and I would take a second sample of your blood and ship it to the same lab under a different name, right? What would the result look like? Would I get exactly the same result back, or would I get a variability in the result? In methodologically speaking, this is called, reliability testing, right? How reliable is that lab going to deliver the same answer every time we submit it? And many of these companies have reliability less or greater than, rather, 37%, somewhere in that neighborhood. What that means is you send your blood off, or I'll send your blood off under two different names. Test X comes back and test Y comes back. Again, same blood, same day, same draw. Lab didn't know the difference. And this result is 37% different than this result. That's not acceptable, and that's not scientific. And that's what a lot of these types of tests yield. And this is where you have to be real careful. Now, there's a lot of really well-intentioned health coaches out there. So I don't want to say anything bad about yours, but the fact of the matter is, health coaches shouldn't be running a ton of lab work, in my opinion. Unless they have really, really solid background biochemical information and training in lab evaluation. Labs can be tricky to navigate. And, it's not to say that you couldn't have found some things that were beneficial from that test, but the biggest problem is the propensity for false positives. And the biggest fear I have for people doing these tests where there's a false positive is, let's say that you're allergic to 25 things according to their test. And really, in actuality, you're only actually truly reactive to 6 of those things. But now we're cutting out 19 additional foods that have the ability to give you good diversity and good nutrition in your diet, because we have false positives coming back on a test that's not accurately validated scientifically to be repeatable, or to even just to be accurate at all. Okay. My celiac panel was negative with only elevation in my IgA. I asked to be referred to specialists in gluten sensitivity. My doctor was not happy about that. I have all the symptoms of celiac. So Karen, if that's the case, get genetically tested for gluten sensitivity. Because even the specialists are going to want to they're going to want to do biopsies on you. I mean, that's the course, right? The specialists do biopsy, and they do, they do a panel. It's called the celiac panel, which is blood testing for gliadin, for anti-tissue transglutaminase typically, and then also anti-endomysial antibodies. It's a mixed bag. You may get a positive, and you may be blessed to get the information. But if you get a false negative, that's where really the trouble comes in. And I see this all the time. People come into my office and, they've been told you don't have to worry about gluten. And the first thing we do is find out that was wrong. And then they change their diet, and guess what happens? Like 20 years of tortuous illness starts to diminish and go away, all because they changed their diet in the proper way. Like, that is so powerful. And so you don't want to let doctors get mad at you. You don't want to let them deter you from being as investigative as possible. But I would suggest you look at doing some type of genetic testing to determine your propensity to react to gluten. And what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to put a URL, a link in, for that as well. Let me just plug that in for you, and you can read more about that kind of testing right there, Karen. So Schiff says, genetic testing, all 4 markers tested positive for gluten. I win. I like that. But now I know why it's not going away, and I'm okay with that. That's just it too. That's the other reason you really like want to get tested, because the not knowing aspect, right? So you guys see my shirt, right? Warrior. Why warrior? Because society, frankly, and I'm just going to be very frank, society sometimes sucks the way they pick on people who try to eat well, right? I mean, what do they say? Health nut is one of the terms. There's even a new medical diagnosis called orthorexia, which it was invented to diseaseify or call people who are concerned about their health and want to eat well, is basically to call them crazy, right? So that we can justify our own terrible behaviors and choices around food. But you know, we want a black and white. Why do you want a black and white answer when it comes to your diet? Because you'll never commit to changing it if you don't know you need to. I mean, I've seen that. Like I said, I've been in practice 21 years, and at first, early on in practice, when I made a shift to really start looking at gluten as a driving factor in people's autoimmunity, at first I would just make the mention that they needed to change their diet. And what I found was about 10% of people with the suggestion that way would actually comply, and 90% wouldn't. But when they had their genetic test and they knew that it was an issue, that gave them the edge in their mind psychologically to then commit to the diet, because it's about a 12-week learning curve. And so now they're going through that learning curve with the intent and with the knowledge that they're going to be doing this indefinitely. This is not like a 6-week diet plan where we're going to get healthy and then we're going to go back to the old way. And so when you can wrap your mind around the commitment, it's a lot easier. And then you can go through what we call the phases of grief, because don't make no mistake, when you cut out gluten, you grew up in America, you cut out gluten, you're mourning, right? You're mourning the loss of a beloved food. You just are. That's just the nature of the beast. Food represents love in our cultures. And when you let one go, that's again why I recommend testing, because to let a food go, you want to make sure it's the right thing to do, because you're going to go through a mourning process, and that takes a toll and can take a toll. And if you don't know whether it's the right thing to do, you're always going to be tempted to go back to it. And if that's the wrong move, it's going to perpetuate a potential problem for you. Let's see here. Can slightly elevated CEA be caused by gluten? If you're referring to the cancer marker CEA, I've not ever made that correlation clinically. So if that's what you're referring to, I would say probably not, although there are instances where we know certain types of cancer are linked to gluten. Either the gluten can cause certain kinds of cancer or it can contribute to. There are about 11 cancers, and they generally from mouth to anus. They're the cancers that populate, you can get oral cancer, esophageal, stomach, small and large intestinal cancers, pancreatic cancer, liver cancer, thyroid cancers, have all been related or linked directly to gluten. And so theoretically, if you were measuring CEA and saw that, it's possible, but I've never seen any great research, and I've never really tracked that marker personally. So I don't want to say yes, but I also don't want to say no. So MJ says, gluten sensitive, it's very challenging. I can't eat any carbs. So what can you eat? My blood sugar goes off without, I assume you mean without the carbohydrates coming from gluten and grains. There's a lot of things that you could consume as a carb beyond grain. So, I mean, one of the biggest categories is your root vegetables, taro and cassava and arrowroot, potato, beet, all acceptable, and all contain, nutrients if they're organically grown, and all contain carbohydrate bases. And then, of course, there's fruit, which can be consumed as well. And then there's some carbohydrate in nuts, although more fat in nuts. And then there's vegetables, right? You got a variety in different types of vegetables. What may be happening to you, MJ, is not so much your lack of carbohydrates. It could be for you, it could be a lack of micronutrients. One of the things that I have seen in people when they can't control their blood sugars transitioning to the diet is that their zinc or chromium or B vitamin levels are deficient, and sometimes magnesium as well. These nutrients help your body process energy from the foods you eat, and particularly carbohydrates. And so if you're deficient in those nutrients, what can end up happening is you can actually have blood sugar swings that feel like you need to eat more carbs, and maybe you even feel better when you eat more carbs. But if you look into those nutrients, you might find if you're low that those types of carbohydrate swings and blood sugar swings go away. It's very common to see that. Let's see. Juan says, why would I have Cushing's syndrome while on a grain-free diet? What nutrients to check for? So Cushing's, which is an autoimmune, so is it Cushing? Is it Addison's? That's an autoimmune problem within the adrenals. And so you want to check vitamin C. You want to check vitamin B5. Those are two main ones. You go back and watch my show from Tuesday, because I talked about vitamin B5 in that regard, and you can check that out if you haven't already. But I would check those. I would check those at least, and then I would probably check a plethora of other ones. And then I would also look at food and chemical environmental stressors that are coming in, because anytime we've got an adrenal issue, a lot of times that's coming from external environmental or food-based stressors, right? Because they're stressing out. If the immune system's reacting, it's stressing out the body. And so if you're already in a state of biochemical stress, even if it's not emotional stress, because a lot of people think about stress and they think about, stress at work or stress with kids or, whatever it might be. But I'm talking about biochemical stress, right? Which is the stress that comes from eating the wrong things, being exposed to the wrong things, or not having enough of the right good things. Those are biochemical stressors that, if you're struggling, you should ask your doctor to measure them. How fast do herbal supplements empty into the intestine? Are you talking about get through the intestine on an empty stomach? Depends on your transit time. Everybody's transit time is different. And some people with a history of gluten issues have reduced transit time, dramatically reduced transit time, because gluten can cause something called gastroparesis, which causes constipation and, bowel movements, maybe a kind of a thing that happens every second or every third day. So it largely depends on your transit time. If you have good transit time, you swallow a few supplements, they're going to be down in your intestines within 30 minutes to an hour. So it doesn't take that long if your transit time is solid. I cut out gluten and dairy over a year ago. It was tough for a couple months, but my MRI scan showed no MS lesions. That's multiple sclerosis lesions, which my neurologist said was excellent. This makes me stick fervently to it. Amen to that. Yeah, I've seen MS lesions go away on gluten-free diets. How do some people eat crap and don't have any issues? They do have issues. Don't believe for 1 second that people eating nonsense are not having issues. They may not have the same issues, or they may not display their issues to the world or talk about their issues to the world, but they're having issues. You don't put into your system bad things and get out great things. It's not forever. It'll always catch you. Now, some people can do it for longer than others before it catches them. But as I mentioned earlier in the show, never compare your health to others or others' ability to do things that you think aren't healthy that you want to do because you perceive that they're doing it without consequence. That's not true. And I see it all the time. That's why I feel confident I can say that. Sorry, I know this is off topic, but how much is the minimum amount of zinc to take to rebuild muscle? I know 30 milligrams is good, but I take a multi that has 12.5, and I don't want to take additional zinc. It's different, Harem. It's different for different people, and it depends on what you mean by rebuild muscle. Are you bodybuilding, or were you severely atrophied because of an illness? But I would look at zinc. Number one, if you really want to know the answer to that question from a therapeutic level, get tested. Have your zinc levels tested, because Then we're talking, if you're low, 50, depending on your size, anywhere from 50 to 150 milligrams a day, which is a lot more than 12 and a half in your multi. And we're also talking about the zinc types, right? Because some zinc types are better absorbed than others. And we're also talking about the state of your stomach and intestines, because if your stomach and intestines are damaged, from past exposures to poor diet or whatever it might be, then you're going to be compromising your capacity to absorb that zinc. So there are a lot of variables within that question, but I would say if you really are struggling, get it tested, because that will help you get more definitive on how much. Let's see. Kenny says, I had a food sensitivity test 1.5 years ago, came back with over 30 foods to avoid. I've avoided many daily. Would it be a good idea to retest now? Yeah, I mean, food sensitivity tests, you wouldn't follow them forever. Again, as I said earlier, 6 to 8 months is generally the time frame of avoidance, from that type of information. Anna's asking, should you do the gluten sensitivity test along with, okay, so I think there's a confusion. So the food sensitivity test, Anna, that I'm referring to, that we do, is not measuring for gluten. And there are specific reasons why. It's measuring for 222 non-gluten, non-grain-based foods. The DNA, and the reason why is the DNA test is the most accurate way to assess gluten. And so that's what we encourage. Anyone who wants to know about gluten should do DNA testing. So they're different. So if you know you're supposed to avoid gluten and you've been doing it the right way, and you're confident that gluten is an issue for you, there's no need to go and do genetic testing for gluten unless you just want to confirm that information. But the food sensitivity test is different. That's measuring 222 non-grain-based foods, because the whole premise we're not doing grain-based foods is because we're trying to identify the foods beyond gluten that many with gluten sensitivity are eating consistently, because they already have transitioned their diet. So again, they're two separate tests measuring two very different things. Is it possible for wheatgrass powder to be gluten-free? I don't recommend it. A lot of people will tell you their wheatgrass powder is gluten-free. I can just tell you what I've observed in 21 years of practice is that people with gluten sensitivities react to wheatgrass and oatgrass and barley grass. So all these green drinks that they're attempting, I just see them clinically do very, very poorly with them. And so, and here's another aspect of that. Maybe they are technically gluten-free if somebody were to analyze them, although there's always the risk of cross-contamination. But yeah, the other thing you have to understand is 40% of the population is allergic to grass. And so you're talking about grass juice, like literally squeezing the juice out of the grass. It's a big risk. I mean, if 40% of the population is allergic to grass, then, it's almost half, right? And whether or not you're in that group, but I'm not a fan of grass juices. I think that whole kick about grass juices, I think it's a bad idea. Why would humans don't, anyway, yeah. Betty wants to know, why would someone develop DH, dermatitis herpetiformis, from gluten later in life at 65 years old? Did they do something to the wheat, and will it ever go away? So number one, did they do something to the wheat? Yeah, they did. They have, over the past many decades, they're doing a lot to the wheat. Multiple hybridizations combined with multiple types of pesticides being sprayed, combined with the way they process and store the grain. It has a tendency to grow mold and mycotoxins. And, so we have a lot of variable in that. But then there's also quantitatively how much people are eating. 70% of the calories consumed in the U.S. in an average American, 70% of it is wheat. So part of it is a quantity issue. So it could be a lot of variables. That's why No Grain, if you ever read my book, No Grain, No Pain, the book is not called No Gluten, No Pain on purpose, because I go through all the different things about grain, even beyond gluten, that create problematic issues. Now, going back to your question, obviously DH is a manifestation of celiac disease. And just because you finally developed it at the age of 65 doesn't mean that gluten wasn't creating problems for you before. One of the things we know about gluten is that it can mask its own toxicity. There are some proteins that we cleave from gluten in our intestines that mimic morphine. And so that, if you've ever heard of morphine, the drug, it acts as an anti-inflammatory pain blocking mechanism. And so for many people, they're eating gluten for very long periods of time, and the gluten, don't feel bad, but the damage is being done. And when the damage hits a certain level, you become symptomatic. And again, that's just because gluten can mask its own toxicity. I know it sounds odd, but it's been researched pretty well. That protein's called gluteomorphine or gluteomorphin, and it's a problem. And it's one of the reasons why we have the term silent celiac disease. It's because person's being damaged and they don't know it until the damage becomes so great that it's expressing physically with symptoms, which is what DH is. And yes, it can go away. It absolutely, DH is an easy thing to make go away once you get your diet dialed in. What's more accurate, 24-hour urine cortisol or salivary cortisol? I don't think it's which one's more accurate. I think it's how it's being measured from a time perspective. So you can do a 24-hour urine output and measure total cortisol. But that's not super helpful because cortisol is a diurnal hormone that has an ebb and flow through the course of your day. So, generally speaking, in the morning when you wake up, your cortisol's peaking high, and at noon it comes down, and in the afternoon it comes down, and in the evening it comes down a little bit more. And then when you fall asleep, it comes down a little bit more. And then, around 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, it starts to creep up. And then, when the sun comes over the horizon, boom, we get a cortisol spike. So in my opinion, it's more accurate to measure cortisol through the course of the day versus trying to measure it as a 24-hour urine output. But if you were going to do it, you could measure it in the urine. You'd also want to do it in a timed fashion along that circadian pattern of cortisol production. What do I think of consuming food-grade clay with electrolyte salts and mineral supplements at the same time to bind to toxins? I think, why are you trying to take clay to bind toxins? I mean, that's the first thing, I think, because clay is not something I would recommend on a general daily basis as a binding agent to get rid of toxins. If you're going to take something more daily, I would use something like Mycobinder Plus, which is not clay. It's a mixture of zeolite and charcoal. Some of those clays, in my opinion, not the best. Now, that being said, even if you've got a really good clay, the other question I would ask is, what are you trying to bind in terms of toxins? Because to me, if you feel the need that you have to bind toxins every day, then your environment needs to change more than that. You need to take a supplement, because your liver and your GI tract and your lung and your kidneys and your skin should be filtering the environment well for you without the need to worry about a forever detox. Let's see here. Dr. Osborne, do you ever eat any gluten, like one bite of chicken rice soup or one slice of pizza? No, I don't. I quit doing that years ago. Now, don't get me wrong. When I first went gluten-free, gosh, it's been, I guess, close to 20 years, maybe not quite, that I've been gluten-free. In the beginning, yes. But for me, what ultimately happened was when I would cheat, I wouldn't feel well. And my body just, the more I avoided it, the more in tune my body got. And so when I would get exposure, it was like my body was screaming at me, what the hell are you doing? Stop it. Right. And so it just became where I just became more and more in tune and more intuitive, where I just decided, you know what, if my body's going to tell me that that's not good, it's not worth it to me. And that's one of there's 3 cardinal rules of eating that I try to subscribe to. And I would recommend that any of you watching this also look at. And that, number 1, you can't get healthy or stay healthy eating food that isn't healthy. And I'm gluten sensitive genetically. I've got 4 markers. So for me, gluten's not healthy. And so that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, If you feel bad when you eat it, your body's right. Quit eating it. No matter what anyone else tells you. I don't care if there's 1,000 doctors telling you you should eat this food because it's a superfood and it's good for you. If your body's trying to tell you to reject it, you listen to your body. Your body's right. And then the third rule is don't eat what you're allergic, sensitive, or intolerant to. And that's, sometimes that's easy to discover, through a good elimination diet. And with delayed hypersensitivity, it's not easy to discover. It's a challenge. It can be a big challenge. Like for me, I was reactive to green tea and I didn't know it. And I was drinking green tea. And so, food sensitivity wise, so it was a delayed response for me. So I got rid of the green tea. Again, it's a healthy food for people that don't have the reactions to it, but I was one that did. How important is emotional stress compared to diet? It's on the same level of importance. They're equally important. Liquid bentonite clay as a detoxifier. Again, I think that's part 2 of that same question. What are my thoughts on collagen powders? I was considering buying a gluten-free brand, but I have heard they can contain heavy metals. They can contain heavy metals, Antonella. We have one. You can check out Ultra Collagen if you want to check out one that's actually grain-free and is actually tested for heavy metals. That's part of our process, in our facilities, is that we have stringent testing to ensure that we're not getting heavy metal in our product. Okay, let's see. I'm running out of time, folks. I've got maybe answer 1 or 2 more here. I wonder, since 70% of the world population eats rice, makes me wonder gluten harm on global scale. Of course it is. You look at the cultures that eat rice and they have the biggest incidence of heart disease and diabetes. It's also a problem because rice is a heavy contaminant with lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. Not all rice, but a lot of it that's grown today is. But that whole argument, I hear it all the time, is that what about the Oriental cultures and the Indian cultures that eat a lot of rice? Yeah, they have a lot of heart disease, they have a lot of metabolic syndrome, they have a lot of diabetes. So they're not immune either, and I believe that they're have just as great of a proclivity to be gluten sensitive as any other culture. Okay, ton of last second question. We'll have to come back for those, guys. I've got a hard stop today. I've got another meeting I've got to get to. I just wanted to do this show impromptu to make up for missing yesterday. So thanks for spending your Friday afternoon with me. We'll be back on Monday, or I'm sorry, we'll be back on Tuesday at 6 p.m. We've got a great show coming up for you. Super fantastic interview that I'm doing. And so make sure you don't miss it. That's going to be 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you're new to the show, make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget about our mission to save 100 million lives. So hashtag save 100 million lives, and share this information with your friends and family. Together we can change the world. This whisper, right? This whisper of common sense and functional nutrition that it is right now can become the roar that it needs to be, because we're not going to save the planet by eating processed soy and processed pea and processed garbage. We're going to save the planet by getting information and empowering people on what health actually is and what they need to do to maintain it. And so, I'm here every week for you guys, twice a week. Make sure you're sharing this information so that we can reach more people and transform the health and the lives of our fellow humankind. Thanks, and have a great weekend.